Ladies and gentlemen, Luke is awesome. I love speaking with Luke. It's always insight. His blog is fantastic. Y'all, everyone needs to check that out. His work on Gurdjieff is completely invaluable and clear and elegant, and something you remember and take with you, which is extremely important. There are many books you read and don't take with you, you forget about, but Luke's work is one you carry with you for the rest of your life. And then it has an impact on you in very important ways. And I always enjoy speaking with him, always appreciate his insight and the way that he carries himself and lives his life and that he brings into these conversations. So, Luke, thank you for being here. And Luke, hey, you wrote a blog, Demonology, Angelology, and the Problem of Evil. I really enjoyed it. And as I enjoy all your writing, and why'd you write it, Luke? What were you thinking about? What were you thinking about, Luke?
Well, nice to be here with you, Daniel. It's always a joy. Yeah, that was a strange blog. It kind of crept up on me as we were just talking about prior to going live. There is this sense through all of the conversations that I've been having that people are picking up on something. That
Mm.
there's something not quite right. They can't put their finger on it. Might be the news, the wars, the chaos which is constantly being fed to us every day. But it seems to be something more than that. And with all of the conversations that I've been having unprompted, this seems to be something that rises to the surface. There's something's not quite right. There's something in the air. And so it just got me thinking again about this question of spiritual warfare, this question of this unseen realm, which was a book by Michael Heiser that I know that we've both read and really kind of doing a little bit of a deeper dive into it. And it also got me thinking a bit more about Gurdjieff's work, and he certainly has a whole system around angels and demons and all of those sorts of things. But while that's heavy language, it does seem to point to something. It seems to point that there are influences, let's just call them that, which do act on us and through us. And sometimes we can pick up on it, sometimes we can intuit it, because it's not really part and parcel of our culture. Everything is now so secular that power is something that's imbued in humans, imbued in our politics, imbued in a whole range of things. And where the Bible, as well as kind of Gurdjieff, says quite clearly that most of these larger influences, these larger currents which wash through our species, don't originate with us, but from somewhere else. And Gurdjieff has his own, kind of way to speak about it. The biblical authors have their way to speak about it. But comes down to this experience. What's going on? What's this sense? What's this something not quite right? And so that really, begs this question here of, okay, we need to find a way to talk about this without the hang-ups of history and a range of other things, but also at the same time to acknowledge that these unseen realms is part and parcel of our world,
Mm.
but also the experience with it. And so this is a question, and maybe this is also a question for you, and you might want to
Sure.
run with it or not. But how do we know the difference
Mm.
between what is us, our experiences, the associations, thoughts, feelings, and what is external to us that is influencing us, that is passing through us? What is the taste of that? And I get this sense from all of the conversations that there is a taste because people are tasting it. They are feeling it. There's something, it's not coming from me, but there is something that is touching me or influencing me and seems to be touching and influencing others. Of course, in the Christian faith, there's a whole, kind of language around that. Again, also Gurdjieff has that. But I think it becomes quite poignant with everything that's happening, the whole AI tech thing, wars, everything that's going on in kind of politics. How do we make sense of that? And it seems that some of the response does not lie in the ordinary way of thinking about it, or at least
Right.
how we've been trained. There
Right.
seems to be something else needed some way of being able to approach it that can include these unseen realms, whatever that may be, because of the experiences that we have of this something not quite right. And so the blog, as well as reading Michael Heiss's book and a range of other books, and this podcast is really all about, just kind of opening up that question, not trying to get kind of bogged down into any one schema or any one kind of language base. But it's quite real when, at least from my point of view, when more ordinary folk are feeling this, but don't have a means with which to express it.
I think you're putting your finger on like the moment in critical ways. Okay. So a few things. So first, this book is awesome. Michael Hesser, The Unseen Realm, Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible. So obviously this is one frame to think about what you're getting at, but one does not have to adopt that frame. But it's actually, the reason why I think that is really, really important. I remember William Wilson assigned a book in his class on the modern state, and I didn't even know Reinhold Niebuhr had a brother, Richard Niebuhr. I was like, oh, interesting. And he wrote a book that's called Radical Monotheism in the Henotheist West or something. I can't quite remember. But the point was that he was arguing, he's like, hey, you do know that in the Torah, there's not one God. There's like a whole lot of spiritual beings, right? It's more of a henotheism, I think is the term, which means there are many gods, but one of the gods is so much more God than the other gods. It's as if the other gods aren't even gods, right? And that he was like and he was kind of arguing politically. And he's saying, so the political vision of that Christianity is ultimately embedded in is a henotheism, which would lead to different political conclusions and thinkings, right? And I remember reading that and going, that's funny that you can read a Bible for so many years and not notice something. And of course, this book is just like really systematic about it and really tearing it down. And like, for example, like really tearing down the paradigms that one perhaps has that makes you able to read so many passages in the Bible and not see what you're reading, which is always remarkable. From everything, for example, in the notion that there's a divine council from the beginning of creation, when God said, let us, it's a divine council. You can associate that with Revelation. He makes the argument this isn't the Trinity. It has to be the council. That doesn't mean there isn't a Trinity, but there clearly are the Elohim, spiritual beings that are made that are not just angels. And then they rebel, and that the rebellious Elohim is each other religion, Baal, the Babylonian, like each nation has its own kind of spiritual force and so on. And the reason why this is also way more needs to be said, but if we even just accept that, then Christianity changes dramatically. Because, for example, instead of, salvation being about you're saved and, so that you can have eternal life, it's kind of like you're saved to be part of the battle against these spiritual forces. That's a very different picture, right? And actually, I would argue one of the reasons why some forms of Christianity have been impoverished has been actually because they've been missing this cosmic vision. Like this bigger picture is not there, which in one way sounds burdensome and perhaps overwhelming. In another way could be exciting. And in another way is the necessary way to think about our moment. Because you could say is that by not taking seriously the unseen realm, there's a way in which that feeling of there's something not quite right, or there's things being pulled along that are not reducible to human agency, then the myth, which doesn't mean it's false, but just myth, the structure of understanding of spiritual warfare in the unseen realm can actually provide a way for people to get their finger on what's going on and to think about Christianity, if one is a Christian, as somehow being moved into a position to participate in the battle of these spiritual forces is very, very different than just simply thinking I'm avoiding hell or I'm avoiding damnation. And the name of the game is to say, tell people about Jesus so they don't go to hell as well. Regardless of what one thinks about that, that's a very different mindset than being like Jesus and spreading the word of Jesus, being tied to be in a better position to deal with these unseen forces, right? And in that sense, if these unseen forces have agency, This would suggest that basically there's something about Christianity and having agency, actually having agency, actually having sovereignty and freedom that are strongly tied together. Because there's a suggestion that if you're ignorant of this unseen realm, then you actually are going to just be a puppet. Like you're not going to have agency, right? And regardless of what one thinks about that way of thinking, and one could certainly go into great depth on Hesser's work. I highly suggest it. Regardless of what one thinks about that, it is gesturing toward what I think more and more people on the average feel. And it's extraordinary to me how much people are, even if they don't believe in religion, resonate with someone like Nick Land talking about the oscillate or these kind of demonic or the lemurs or this kind of techno Cthulhu, as Mikey Downs points, that's kind of pulling us along, and AI is pulling us where we don't want to go. The language of Nick Land is there's a demonology that is going on there. And there are many people like, yes, that's kind of getting at it, right? That seems closer to what it is, right? And it's just very interesting. In a way, I guess that sometimes for people who, to offer a way to think about how perhaps these demonic forces work, that perhaps doesn't have the loaded language for some people, is think about like game theory problems. Like right now, why is everyone building AI? Even though a lot of people are like, this may kill us all, right? It's like, well, the Chinese are doing it, so we have to do it, right? So that's very interesting because it's as if no one wants to do this, maybe, or do it in this quick of a way, or to do it so recklessly, you could argue. Now, you may argue against it, but the point is there's this feeling of we have to do it even if we don't want to, right? That's a kind of spiritual dynamic. And I would actually strongly argue that many times when people in the past spoke about spiritual forces, they were talking about this kind of feeling, this feeling that there is something that even if nobody wants to do it, you find yourself doing it, like a multipolar trap, right? So think game theory problems when we think spiritual warfare, for one. Obviously, there's a long tradition of things like possessions, all of that with spiritual warfare. But if we're thinking on the kind of social level that I think people are gesturing toward, you have these game theory problems. Another example that I always like to use is Kafka novels, because I think Kafka is absolutely getting at that. And for me, a lot of people talk about Orwell and Huxley as visions of totalitarianism, but I actually think Kafka is the best, because a way to look at Kafka is in Joseph K's The Trial, he finds himself in a situation, where he's accused of a crime and he's not told what it is, where in response to that, he decides what the best thing it is to do, but whatever he decides to do actually makes his situation worse. And when he does what's rational, then it gets worse. And it's like the very rational activity further entraps him in the problem. And then at the end of the novel, when he's killed, they turn the knife around and offer it to him as if he's supposed to stab himself. So the whole idea that Joseph K is that he himself couldn't stop himself from ending up here because of the way he understood his situation, because of how he used rationality, if you will. And I would argue The Castle and many Kafka novels are like this. I also think of Cleel's Angel of History being dragged along, as Walter Benjamin said, and there's this pile of death in it, but it can't stop being pulled in that direction, right? So you're just kind of pulling along. The last Kafka example I'll make, and then throw it back on you to any response about anything, is and David Foster Wallace really liked this story. It was called A Little Fable. And there's this mouse going down this hall, and the mouse goes, "Oh me, or my, the walls are closing in, and up ahead is a trap. I don't know what to do." "You simply need to change your direction," said the cat, and ate up the mouse. So it's funny, right? That's the funny thing about Kafka. It's hilarious. But that's also interesting, because there's something about demonic logic that is funny and terrifying at the same time, actually. And there's a kind of a history of that, where it's like really funny because it's like easy. Like in a way, the whole like multipolar traps are kind of funny, because it's like, well, can't we just all not do this? No, we can't. Why can't we? I don't know why. It's kind of funny and horrible at the same time. That blending of horror and comedy kind of actually often is how these spiritual warfares work, actually. There's kind of this inability to stop something that should be really easy to stop, and yet we can't do it, right? Like another, I keep making examples, but I'll stop. Like the other example is the Cuban Missile Crisis. I look at that all the time. Like, isn't this easy? Can't we like just agree not to blow up the earth? Like the Cuban Missile Crisis is nuts. Like when you read, like I suggest everyone Countdown to Armageddon. He also wrote the book The American Prometheus on Oppenheimer, what the movie was based on. But I would force everyone to study the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is crazy, and that to me is a wonderful example of spiritual warfare and actually how it works, because like they're basically like, man, I wish we didn't have to end the world, but we have no choice now. And it's hilarious and horrible at the same time. But because, well, if we do this, the Russians will do this, and then this will happen, so we have no choice. And the reason the world didn't blow up is arguably because Kennedy did a naval blockade, which didn't make any sense, and that happened to work. And then he had a secret line of communication with Gurdjieff. It's like random stuff, like just random stuff is why we didn't all die, right? And it's hilarious and horrible, and that feeling, I guess that there's this feeling in the air. I know I've said a lot because but there's a part of the feeling is this air. It's this simultaneously feeling of kind of funny, like this kind of comedy and horror at the same time. There's like, man, we're all kind of going somewhere we're not sure we want to go. And in a way, it's really easy to stop. And in another way, it's impossible to stop. And what's going on? Why is this thing kind of turning and pulling us along in this way? And that language of pulling along, I think, is critical. Another example that comes to mind is Ivan Illich, but all Paul's. And again, what I think is just so important, like, so all of those examples of what I sometimes call dynamics with kind of a capital D, these dynamics that get a life of their own. You know, it seems like they're work, like humans make the dynamics and then the dynamics make us. I think that can be for people that can be a way to think about spiritual warfare that people can connect with. Like in my experience, not all, it's like, okay, I know that feeling. I know the feeling of I don't have to answer my cell phone when the boss calls, but I also do have to answer the cell phone when the boss calls. I know that feeling of I have agency, but I don't have agency. That is a feeling that's getting at, for me, spiritual warfare. And that there's an entire structure by which to think about that situation in Christianity that has been lost. It's absolutely been lost. And that I think that's just really consequential because it makes it difficult for us to think our moment. But I'll pause and throw it at you on any thoughts.
Yeah, no, look, they're great points. As you were talking, it was this, this tragic horror story that's also very comedic. What's interesting, about that, and I kind of Gurdjieff talks about this, I'm going to paraphrase a great deal, but when that sense that there's some other influence that's happening and we are being taken away with the current, right? And there's no logic, no reason, there's this underlying sense of loss of control.
Yes.
Because we have, in a way, or used to have anyway, so much trust in all of the social structures that we have, not just with government and institutions and all of those sorts of things, but there's this inherent trust that, yeah, we're kind of going okay. And then there's these forces which we begin to feel that just take us in a completely different direction. And even when it's like with the Cuban Missile Crisis and other things, where clearly we're going off the edge of a cliff, but we look around at everybody, no one's at the helm. I suppose we just go with the flow, even if it means our own death. Way it is, So there's that really interesting sense. And Gurdjieff talks about this, and it's about, kind of planets and the way that they align and all these influences and the energies that move across the cosmos and within the planet and everything else. But essentially we can have moments in history of realization that we are not in control at our own level. There might be things that we are at our own kind of level of agency, which is small, which is essentially boils down to where I pay attention. And that's about it. But there's this sense then that if there are all these larger forces at play, And it really brings into question, what do I really have control over? Which becomes very small. All of a sudden, it brings this other question of, well, what influences am I under? That generally tends to produce one of two things. And this is kind of what Gurdjieff says. Either you knuckle down and try to ignore the fact that there's all these massive forces which are washing over you, and you try to control as much as you possibly can within the spheres that you have, which makes you scramble around like a hungry dog, which then makes things worse because you don't see the larger forces and the actions at play. Or you begin to put into question, what are those larger forces at play? A tacit, kind of indication to one begins to awaken a bit. Not take any action, but just what's here. And Gurdjieff says it's those moments where we go two ways. Either we just make everything worse, or we begin to understand our true place in the universe, which is not what we think it is. And so this idea of spiritual warfare, I think, is so abhorrent to modern people, because it kind of indicates there are this unseen realm, these forces that we don't have any control over. We don't vote for them. Like, well, okay, maybe we're not just pawns in a game. We have a part to play, but it's very difficult to understand what that part is when we don't understand that there's this other realm here that is acting on us in various different ways. And instead we ignore it. And so therefore we ignore not so much the problem, but the genesis of all of these sorts of powers. The other thing that I got from Michael Heiss's book, which really just kind of smacked me in the face, that part of Christ's kind of mission was a recruitment drive to replace the rogue sons of God. When you kind of put it in that sense, it also links of a number of conversations that I've had of, why can't we get, better kind of politics, better politicians? Why are all these people who are in these, roles, clearly not of good kind of character? And yet that's exactly what part of Christ's mission is to essentially recruit people into eventually becoming part of working with him over his lordship over heaven and earth by literally replacing these rogue sons of God, the Elohim. And so this becomes really interesting, that there's this greater sense of hope that if we do see the chaos in the world, that there is the opportunity, not only in this life, but in something to strive for where I can be of service.
This is very important. Again, something I really appreciate is how he points out this book's going to be about all those passages your pastor skipped because they were weird. I was like, great. Okay, that stuff about like Paul talking about ruling over the angels, just move. And he's like, no, let's focus on that. And also critically, sons of God are not angels. These are different. They are different spiritual beings. If it is the case that Christ is recruiting people to replace the fallen Elohim, to the fallen sons of God, then there's something about learning how to rule. My leg just fell asleep. It's really something. So that's a demonic force. There's something about then therefore being Christian is tied to, well, learning to rule, right? And the question is, what are you learning to rule? I would argue it is somehow tied to learning to rule these dynamics we're talking about, which no one in history has ever figured out how to rule. And you could argue run the world, because they tend to come into play, especially as the world is all connected, because to take a mythological view of that, as you connect it all together, you supercharge all the spiritual forces. And so the force of these dynamics is really multiplied. And that's one of the reasons it's like people are starting to feel more pronounced something that you could say was always in the air, but wasn't made so visible or so energetic that then the average person is like, there's just something going on. And there's something about we've never developed a kind of, well, we've never developed human beings that can rule over these dynamics. We've never made humans that can make tools and not be overmade by their tools back, right? We've never made dynamics that don't make us back. And so a way to look at this, if one wants to take, you know, a less religious view, is at the very least, Christianity is asking the question, what would it mean to make human beings that are capable of ruling over their dynamics versus being ruled by their dynamics? What would it mean to have humans that had mastered game theory, for example, or not ended up like Joseph K, or who could avoid ending up in those situations, et cetera, right? That is actually a very practical question. Like that is actually, it's a, you know, that a spiritual structure of spiritual warfare can help us even ask, because you could argue we don't even ask that question or think about rulership in those terms because we don't even have the mental model by which to approach it, right? And the unseen realm can help with that. I think also, I'm glad you said what you said because it reminded me of something. So you asked a really great question. How can we tell to what when we have agency versus our agency is actually more reflecting something external to us, right? So for me, and it's just a theory I have that I cannot prove, but you know, those are some of my favorite, is that there's something about the demonic that has this tragicomedy feel, and I've already pointed to it, this tragic comedy feel. And it kind of makes sense because if the demonic is kind of powerless, you know, it's kind of comic, it doesn't really have any power, you know, it's not God, it can't, and yet it's also destructive. It would make sense that there's something comedic about how the demonic operates. And so for example, when somebody says, like the person, for example, so I'll allude to that Ivan Illich example. So there's a lot of people now that go to a party and they're at the party and the whole time all they do is take pictures of being at the party. And that's all they do. That's all they freaking do. They spend the whole party taking pictures of being at the party. It's hilarious, but it's also horrible because it means that they're compelled the entire time. They can't even enjoy the party. They have to document the party because that's what validates the party, because what validates the party is creating social currency on Facebook or Instagram, for example, right? Does that person have agency? Do they have agency in that example? Not really, because they are unable to escape the social pressures or the social dynamics that makes them spend all their time at parties taking pictures of parties. Or another example, we've seen this. The two people on a date that spend the entire date doing what? We know what we're going to say. We know what we're going to say, texting. They spend the entire date on their phone texting. And you look over there and you kind of go, you're not trying. Here's the issue. I'm not trying to be. I'm sounding judgmental, but what I'm trying to say is I'm actually not trying to be judgmental. I'm trying to say there's a certain sort of like there's no agency here. There's a certain kind of lack of agency. It's like even if it's not like, oh, these two kids can't talk to one another. It's almost as if more like even if they wanted to talk to each other, it's almost like they can't because the demands of the cell phone or the pull of attention is so high. Like when adults are like, well, just put down your cell phone. It doesn't work that way because if they put down the cell phone, there's real social cost, real work cost. Their attention has been wired to it. And also, in my opinion, there are just as many older people addicted to their phones as younger people. The young kids get scapegoated. So kids, I'm going to say that to get out of that judgmentalism. I wasn't being judgmental, okay? I'm trying to describe spiritual warfare. So it's like, can you really describe that situation with the kids on their phones, which I would call the dynamics? Can you really describe that in the language of free will or not, right? Like agency or not? No, it feels like they're under forces that are not. But here's my key point. When I describe to you the kids on their cell phones during the date, it's funny. There's a funniness, right? The first thing you fear is it's funny, and then it's tragic. When I describe the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's funny, but also tragic. Evidence that you are, dare I say, possessed, or that your evidence that your agency is not at play in the situation, but instead an external agency that some people might call spiritual warfare. Evidence that is occurring is if just looking at your situation is simultaneously funny and tragic at the same time. If you look at the situation and see a tragic comedy, then that's a spiritual situation. That's spiritual warfare right there, right?
Yeah.
That's a great sign that you're dealing with agency that is under a spiritual warfare, an Elohim, or however we want to word it, right? Human agency that is more just on its own power doesn't end up, in my opinion, is not characterized by the tragic comedy in the same way. It doesn't have that same tragic comedy. It might just be willpower or perseverance or difficulty or heart. But when you're in this like tragic comedy situation, that tends to be evidence that you're dealing with something of spiritual warfare. This thing that simultaneously seems really easy to stop and then impossible to stop at the same time. I think actually, and this would be a larger argument, I think also another reason why we don't have a good sense of the qualities of spiritual warfare. What I'm trying to find a language is like a spiritual warfare situation, if you will. Like maybe I'll say a spiritual situation, an SS. One of the reasons we perhaps don't have a grasp on these SSs is because also I think a lot of literature was about them. Literature was describing these tragic comedy situations at the same time. Like I think Sophocles, Fate, all of these are notions of SS, these kind of forces where you end up somewhere and you're like, how did this occur? Right? We don't have a literary society, and that perhaps helps us not be able to recognize situations that have this kind of cosmic scale to it, this kind of larger unseen realm in operation. And so we simply see it as getting back to messages or my job or texting. We don't see it as a kind of a dynamic that we're captured in and that our agency is called in. So yeah, the first thing, and actually it's very interesting to think of other qualities of evidence that you're dealing with an SS, which I'll just say for short in this conversation. It's very interesting to think of qualities that would help you recognize an SS versus simply a situation of, I want to say willpower maybe, or that may not be good language, but just agency, just human agency.
Yeah.
Like it's this, the tragic comedy seems to be one strong quality of it. The inability to stop is also another key, like you can't stop it is another quality. The inability to set boundaries seems to be a quality of it, an inability to set limits. More is coming to mind, but I'll pause there and throw it at you on anything.
Yeah, no, that was great. It really got my mind thinking on a couple of things, which I might kind of throw back at you, but I might
Please.
pick up on your first point about, the ability to rule, right? So what does that mean? First of all, and Gurdjieff talks about this, I need to be, and this is quote unquote, master of myself. I need to be able to rule myself. How do I, and that has a range of kind of dimensions to it. But so how do I keep myself in check? How do I, through all of the conditioning of my life, my culture, my language, all the other things that I've been exposed to, how do I keep myself on track? How do I regulate myself? The whole sort of psychology of it, if I can call it that. And so, if you're looking at a great deal of the subset of spiritual warfare, which is really spiritual training,
Yes.
Becoming a soldier, right?
Yep.
You need to have training. You need to have some kind of discipline or preparation. What's all that for? Well, the first thing is how do you keep yourself in check? How do you keep yourself regulated? How do you rule yourself? Maybe imperfect, but there's this sense, not so much of kind of domineering, but a sense of I understand all the energies and forces to an extent that are at play in me, and I can foresee what things I might need to do in order to ensure I don't get pulled away to extremes purely based upon my own conditioning.
Right.
So that seems to be quite a big part of the spiritual training, which is very, very difficult because it opens your eyes to just how kind of conditioned I am. All my attitudes, all my, just everything comes out, all of the passions, everything that I thought, oh no, I'm kind of an honest guy, and then all of a sudden you start seeing yourself lying. You know, all of these things, all of these kind of images that I have of myself start to maybe get put into question when I start to try to rule my own kingdom, if you'd like.
Yep.
And then it becomes something interesting, and Gurdjieff and many other paths talk about this, that at some point there's the conditioning side of things, and then there can be these foreign elements that come in. So in a way, one also needs to build a spiritual immune system of there's you, Daniel and Luke, and we have our history, our baggage, everything that comes with it. We have our quirks, blah, 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 blah. And we hopefully over time have a bit of a sense of the stuff that we need to keep in check. Some of the techniques, exercises and training that might be helpful, things that are not helpful. And that's often there's a general principle kind of behind that, but there's also other principles which are unique to you. So for you, something might be helpful, but for me, it might not be. I might need something else, but it's all about this. How do I keep myself in check? How do I rule my own self? Because there's no way I can rule others if I can't rule myself. Again, all imperfect. But then there's this sense of some other foreign agency, some other foreign influence, that there is something that comes into me that might utilize the conditioning. It's almost like the inverse of a spiritual gift, the spiritual gifts that God brings, these unseen realm, these other forces can equally use those gifts, but for their own kind of purposes. And so this becomes really interesting and maybe loops back to what you were saying and this earlier question of how do I know what's from me and what's not from me without getting caught up into imagination and fantasies and, seeing a devil behind every rock and all of those sorts of things. But what is it? And of course, there's something very quiet in that. What's the old saying? The devil doesn't normally speak loudly. He whispers, Gurdjieff had the same type of sense that there's these higher world laws. And a person, if they're under spiritual training, which by default is engaging in the spiritual warfare, needs to be able to discern what influence to come under, because we have no choice about being influenced. All of us are influenced. That's just the way it is. But it's what influence we wish to come under. And so maybe this loops back to this, what he kind of talks about, that there are moments in history where we sense there's something not quite right. We sense there's some change in the atmosphere, that there is this foreign element. Maybe our, the immunity, our spiritual T cells are activating, going, hang on, there's something coming in here that is not right. And so that's a bit of a prelude there. And so this becomes very interesting for me in terms of what do we do practically? There's one sense, yes, we need to have a new language, a new framework, maybe not so much new, but at least one that we're able to grasp that these influences don't just reside in humans. They don't just reside in our politics or social kind of structures, that there's something else that might be moving through. And how can we be a bit more attuned to that without going mad? Because one of the side effects I've seen, and I certainly see this in myself with everything that's going on in the world, is that if you're not anchored into something, then it can really make you go quite mad, and because you're so upended, there's nowhere, at least for the intellect, to go, okay, I might have a sense that there's something broader, something of a level I don't understand, but I at least have a sense about it, whereby once you take out the supernatural and I don't really like that word, but anyway, let's
Sure,
just
sure.
kind of use it. You take out this notion of spiritual warfare. You take out this notion that there are other forces at play that we need to contend with. The alternative is, well, then I need to contend with other humans.
Correct.
And so therefore, why don't we fight them or kill them? And so it really brings this sharp contrast on, if I feel that these influences, these powers, however you want to cast that, is coming only from human agency, then the problem lies with humans and the solution lies with humans. But if there's something else, that doesn't mean we don't have a part to play. But if there's something else that might be behind the scenes here that everybody needs to contend with in some way, shape, or form, it starts to ameliorate some of those woeful kind of the results that we've seen in the past and the results that we're seeing now, which is just carnage.
I agree. I think that's really, really important. Well, there's a few things like the other, as a kind of point to that, like Hesher's talking about, like, for example, Eden wasn't the entire planet, right? It was one area where the
Yeah.
the council is going to meet, right? And that actually the idea of humanity was to spread Eden, right? So there's a kind of global message there, right? There's a certain sort of making creation. This also, again, helps this entire vision of the unseen realm helps some of the problematic well, in the end, the Left Behind series, Rapture, it doesn't really matter if we take care of the environment. It really doesn't matter what we do because we're going to get pulled along. Ironically, there's a weird thing here where actually removing the unseen realm makes you more disembodied. You would think that getting rid of the unseen, it's
Yeah.
hilarious. Again,
Yeah.
Tragicomic, you would think like getting rid of the unseen realm would make us more embodied. It's the exact opposite. Like, actually, it really hurts Christianity. And then you could also weirdly say that getting rid of the unseen realm in materialism or someone who's non-theistic actually makes them less embodied as well. They become more technological. They become more actually kind of domineering in the bad sense versus stewarding, right? So another way to put this, and of course, those are all vast generalities. There's something about the loss of the unseen realm and the loss of stewardship that goes together. It's hard for us to think in terms of stewardship and without that thinking, right? We get in trouble, and the great Clayton has been doing work on the embodied steward, which I really appreciate. But there's a great irony there that's really, really something. Quickly, another thing that I was going to say that there's also something characteristic of what is an SS, a spiritual situation, if the very describing of it gets rid of it. Like if you just put it into words and that kind of kills it, there's something about that. So, for example, um, if we're stuck on our date looking at our cell phones, if I'm able to look up and say, "Isn't it kind of funny that we're just sitting here looking at our cell phones?" Oh yeah, you're right, and then we put it away. Like it breaks it. Like the word it
Yeah.
creates, the
Yeah.
word is living, and there's something about merely putting the tragic comedy into words that then makes it go from horror to funny, and then when it's funny, we let it go, right? And so there's something about human agency that comedy, laughter, and joy go together, whereas there's something in the demonic where tragedy and comedy go together, and you're concealed from the comedy because you're in the tragedy. But if you could take a meta view or bring it into language, it can break the spell. And it's interesting. Words, spelling words, these things kind of go together. And so there's also something about the SS uh where it's actually weak to being put into language. It doesn't want to be described. It doesn't want to be put into words, which is interesting. And perhaps, there's always this kind of long history in philosophy and thought where words kind of control us, where we're made by words. It's funny to think that perhaps words do that when we don't use them to put the spiritual realms into language to thus free us from its agency. So we're not using language to describe SSs, and therefore language makes us in a Kafkaesque way because we're not using it actually to open up clearings of human agency. So there's something about the ability to describe as breaking bondage, putting into words, that seems very important. And that also makes you think things like prayer and stuff like that. I think also there's a few things as you were speaking that were just coming to mind. Is that first off, we might also associate these demonic dynamics with things like Paul Virilio on speed. And Owen and the Agap talks about that. Everything gets fast, and so you can't slow down, and you feel like it's just speeding up, speeding up, speeding up, and you can't stop it. So Paul Virilio on speed. And each one of these would have to be elaborated on, but you have this notion of speed. He also talks about the perpetual emergency, where there's always an emergency. And that feels like an SS, because if you act like everything's okay, then you're irresponsible and you're not thinking about the people suffering over there, and there's a perpetual emergency, and come on, man, you gotta do something. Do what? Don't know, but do something. And again, there's a tragic comedy in the perpetual emergency, right? I think, Matthew Stanley points out that I think the US has been in like a perpetual emergency for 40 years or something. So there's like infinite executive power. Great. So that's kind of another sort of like, can we just kind of look around and see there's not an emergency, right? Like we're good. No, you're blind, you're ignorant, you don't know the truth, right? And that kind of feeling of they're coming, they're coming for you, man. That also is that feeling of not having agency. That's problematic. So and I think also, so the thing that my mind is going to as you're speaking, because like you say, well, let me finish that Eden point. You said so much that's so important, is that if you realize that in the Bible, there's this global mission, right? Then right there, that kind of suggests your enemy can't be other human beings because they're part of the global mission. They're supposed to be brought into the fold, right? So once you kind of go, well, the reason why we actually are struggling to spread new creation is because of demonic forces, then you can kind of make sense of what Jesus is doing with forgiveness. Like forgiveness is really difficult because aren't you enabling the bad guy? Aren't you enabling the evil? Well, forgiveness is a tough problem. I think it's a huge one that we really have to think and approach. But if we understand that, well, forgiveness is reminding you that your enemy is the principalities. You forgive this person to keep in focus who your real opponent is, right? So it's not actually to stop fighting in it, because people associate forgiveness and passivity, right? It's like if you forgive, then you're giving up. But there's a way which, if you take seriously the unseen realm, that forgiveness is keeping your eye on the target, keeping your eye on the real opponent, which are these dynamics that are in operation. Does that mean that there shouldn't be crime and, that there shouldn't be jails or whatever? Well, there's been a long history of understanding that forgiveness and corporal and punishment, those aren't mutually exclusive positions. It's another topic. But the point is that taking seriously the unseen realm can start to make sense of a lot of stuff that otherwise doesn't seem to make much sense, or seems like it would be contributing. Like, one could argue that many of perhaps, I think Nietzsche is more interesting, but the popular understanding of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity is perhaps valid in the Christianity that doesn't have a strong sense of the unseen realm. But when you see that, no, actually all of the Christian ethics are actually in a way to keep one oriented toward the battle with the unseen realm, the spiritual warfare. Oh, so these things that seem to make us weak are actually keeping us rightly oriented to the real battle. Got it. Okay. So there is a power there. So, but and I'll throw it to you. But the other thing I was going to say is that it's really interesting too when we talk about the dynamics, because it makes me think as well of this just interesting fact that God doesn't want a temple, right? He doesn't want a temple. He doesn't want a king. He wants a tent. He wants a tabernacle. And I've been more and more kind of exploring this interesting, like, what's the difference between tabernacle and temple? And, well, you get the tabernacle, the king, and then Solomon builds the temple, and, then Jesus, the body, as the temple, right? What's really interesting is trying to think that in light of the Elohim and the spiritual warfare that the book is talking about. Because there's almost a suggestion that temples increase the probability of problematic dynamics, like a ziggurat, right? Like the Tower of Babylon, right? And so there's this idea that God's like, I don't really want a temple because there's something about temples that tend to create dynamics that are really problematic, right? Now, it's interesting because I don't want to say that the social is the spiritual dynamic, because there are different things here, but there's also like when I think of things like money, right? Money is weird because if I tell you, hey, you realize that money is just paper and it's a social construct. You still have to pay your bills. You can know it's a social construct and it still doesn't matter. Like it still impacts you. So there's something right there where money is real and not real. It's in this metaxis space, this between space, if you will, right? There's something about the spiritual that is a between space, right? It's here and it's not here at the same time. And it's almost as if it's not the case that money equals demon, that social equals demonic, but it's as if the social increases the probability of being taken advantage of by the SS situations, or like summoning them without knowing you're doing it, right? And it's almost like one can read God's like, well, all of the nations that are run by the fallen sons of God, the rebellious sons of God, Babylon, Baal, all of those stuff, they have temples. And that actually contributes to the dynamics that are really problematic. So don't build a temple. Don't do it. You could argue, it depends on how you read it, that God never wants a temple, and that ultimately he says, well, Solomon's going to build it, and people assume that means he's like for it. Not necessarily. That could just mean like you guys gave in. You guys gave in. And it's interesting to think if that is the case. And I do think, look, like people, yeah, so many of these kind of forces that seem to be pulling us along are tied to the social structures, the political structures, these kind of systems we build that seem to kind of we make, and then they make us. And there's a sense in which God's resistance to the temple is tied to a kind of awareness that those things tend to generate dynamics that we lose our control. And then when Jesus comes up, he's like, well, the temple is the body. It's like once you move it to the body, then you're actually moving it back to the place where you can master those dynamics. And I guess I bring that up because it's almost like when your temple is the body, there's a better chance that you actually rule properly, right?
Yeah.
Like you were pointing at. When the temple is not the body, then you end up, your rulership tends to get eclipsed by SS, by demonic forces, even if you have the best intentions in the world. And so that's really interesting because then one almost wants to compare what's the difference between the dynamics that form around a temple, quote unquote, technology, face, whatever, any technique, the dynamics that form around a temple and the dynamics of Holy Spirit. Because Jesus seems to want a community of Holy Spirit. So is a Holy Spirit is Holy Spirit social where we rule over dynamics versus are ruled by dynamics, and temple equals social dynamics where the dynamics rule the people. Now, I guess the last, and I'll throw it at you any thoughts, but the last thing I want to say, this may sound as if it's anti-city, city bad, but then we have God clearly saying that marvelous city of Nineveh, and Timothy Keller would talk about that, right? So city does not equal bad. New Jerusalem is a city. And there's this very interesting thing where I think it's quite clear that technology does not equal evil, right? Or stuff like that, right? But there's also an awareness that one of the reasons why New Jerusalem is defined by a new city is because cities are really hard to actually bring into the spiritual forward because they tend to, quote unquote, create this dynamic. So there's some sort of relationship here in the spiritual warfare on learning how to have the temple of the body create dynamics according to Holy Spirit, which is the prerequisite for the possibility of social dynamics not becoming mostly informed by demonic forces. That there's some sort of relationship here that I guess is also really useful, and then I'll stop, is that the reason why spiritual warfare is very useful here is because it helps you get out of the binary of materialism or idealism, the binary of, individual or collective. Because what it's saying is actually you have to take seriously this third thing, the dynamics that form between them. That's the thing you want to focus on, not just getting to the top of the company at the CEO. You want to pay attention to the dynamics that form in how you do it and the culture. I guess I want to say, it makes you focus on culture a lot more, not just like material power or systems. Like what is the culture that's training certain discernment to be aware of these energy and dynamics? I have more notes, but I'm going to stop and throw it to you.
No, that was wonderful. It really kind of makes me think of the divide here that, when The temple is outside of me. That's where my attention goes. The physicality of it. It's out there. It's in the seen realm. And
Right.
so one is constantly pulled out. It needs to be adorned. There's something about its, you know, kind of presence in our world that, you know, needs to have all of the glitz and glamour around it. I mean, that's normally inevitably where it goes. That's not to say there's not kind of beauty there, right? Because this is part of our space. But if it's overdone, if it's overcooked, then it
Right.
takes you away from that unseen. And that unseen realm is so difficult precisely because you're not going to see it out there. It's something through the perceptive organ of your own consciousness and conscience that you gain access to, and that is a turning inward. And so there's this unique kind of marry here, you know, that's taking our species a long time to get to, is this: we have a foot in both worlds. And Heise talks about us co-ruling with the Elohim, you know, co-ruling with the powers of heaven, because they're limited, because their realm is not here. And so, but yet we need to cooperate. And it goes both ways. There is a mutual interest in keeping all of the realms moving, growing. And so this is this, you know, kind of awkward part that kind of humans have. But, you know, the right hand needs to be with God, but the left hand needs to be dug into the earth. And we need to try to keep that kind of tension there and to try to reconcile the two. So it's not one or the other. You know, there's this, I need to be able to sit in this strange, awkward place that requires me to be tapped into both. But yet it is just so easy to be pulled out. You know, and that the body of Christ, and, you know, I kind of argue this in blogs, I'm not the only one, is not the church as we know it. It's not the institutions, it's not the structures, it's not everything that forms around it. It is literally in this unseen realm, this connection, this relationship
Right.
that we have with Christ. The institutions is just the, if you like, the earthly form that is still needed to support the relationships that we have in this world. We still need to pay bills, eat food, all of those sorts of things. But how are they kept in relationship? Forgiveness is that changing the relationship. That, I mean, that it is this really this strange act, you know, to forgive, because the natural kind of tendency is not to, even when I'm justified, you know. But to forgive, what I mean, just to make that effort to go, yeah, as you said, maybe there's something else kind of going on, and this person who I think has aggrieved me is just as much of a puppet as I am, if we don't see what's really going on. And so this is this interesting kind of dynamic, all these energies and forces at play, which are just becoming more apparent when you just see the craziness, the illogic of just, why is this all going on? If you're just trying to contain it to a body or the physicality or earthly life or just humans, it makes absolutely no sense. There's something incomplete about it. And we all sense that because it's all part of our nature. And all of us have the capacity to look outward and inward. It's just where our attention goes.
I think that's very well put. And well, if you don't have attention, then you're not going to be able to notice the thing that if you put into words, it would free you, right? Like you're not going to notice the tragic comedy, and so the dynamics will be able to take over. I think attention is huge on this. I should also note just quickly, like anyone, there's another way where even if you think all of this talk of spiritual warfare and the spiritual is false, et cetera, so forth, that it doesn't exist. Nevertheless, if people wrote this, they created this, there was at least an intuition of a need for some sort of frame by which to
Yeah.
understand something that was intuited as real. And this is how they described it. It gets at something as a frame that we are not able to get at today because we don't use this sort of frame, because we think we're above it, which even if it's quote unquote all false, nevertheless, you actually are more likely to end enclosed and auto-cannibalistic and susceptible to these dynamics because you don't have this framework of the unseen realm by which to think of the current world, right?
Yeah.
I do think, from my bias, I do think there are sociologists talking about things like the fetish and Zizek, the objective fiction, these things like money that are not real and real that control us, the technological essence of Heidegger. I definitely think there have been the disablement of Ivan Illich. There are many philosophers and thinkers who have been pointing at these dynamics that get a life of their own in different ways, in different
Yes.
descriptions. I think Ivan Illich is one of the greats of it. Well, all of this writing in the Bible is trying to capture that spirit and trying to talk about all of that at the same time in a way that the average person could have more access to it, right? And really, when you try another way to look at mythology, which is not a simile for false, mythology ends up being an extremely compressed language that is trying to refer to all of these different domains at the same time. And when you do that, you end up using language like angels or demons or spiritual forces or the miraculous, because that seems to be the only way to compress language in a manner that doesn't lose so much of the information that you can't
Yeah.
meaningfully talk about all of these things. And so there can be use to think about mythological structures as a compressed language that then can unfold in the life of the community for hundreds of years, that will always be available to the average person to help create a metaphor or analogy by which to understand what's going on in their life, without which they're more susceptible to those dynamics and thus more enslaved, right? And so, because metaphors don't just decorate thought, they enable what we can think, right? The very ability, and I.A. Richards, Postman, all these people talk about that, like, these myths, without these myths, there are thoughts you can't think. And if those thoughts you can't think mean you're a slave or auto-cannibalistic or doomed to dynamics, then wouldn't you wish you had that myth so that you could think these thoughts that if you can't think, you're doomed? And one needs to see, again, if you just take an entirely atheist view of it, one needs to understand these myths are dealing with a very real problem of that register, which is the average people need extremely compressed language that can unfold and meet them at the moment that they need it to put into words what they are experiencing, because what you cannot put into words is more likely to bind you. Like we were saying, like when you can describe the tragic comedy, you're free. What are philosophers constantly doing? Like, why do people have the conversations like we're doing? Because there's something about the ability to put into words something that frees you from it. Like, you can be having all of these problems in your life, but then when the therapist articulates it to, it's like bam, like the ability to articulate, to integrate, to hear it said. Maybe it's something you've known your entire life. It's actually something you've known, but not understood, because it hasn't been articulated in a way that without the articulation, you are not free. You may intuit the right direction, but your ability to be confident in it will be low, and the ability to actually go through with the intuition will be low. And then even if you do, you may not have understanding of why, and that can still bother you. So the articulation becomes really important. And these mythological structures are mechanisms of that, for that function in the life of communities, without which the communities don't hold together. And they end up being enslaved by dynamics that they can't then put into language to get. And then the energy is trapped. It makes me think of what you've said, is the energy is moving, like language frees energy. And if we can't language something, the energy gets stuck and then it explodes, right?
Yeah.
So, I say all of that just simply for people who may not share the theological vision. It's still, nevertheless, there's a reason. Please.
Yeah, no, I just like to add, because it kind of reminded me as you were speaking of invocation, right? Particularly with the word that you talk, which you used was articulation.
Yes.
Which also has not only just how can I express the word, but actually how do I engage with something else? How do I articulate with something else? And this for me is really interesting, because it's not so much about the language as is how is that language or that naming expressed.
Yes.
which when you look at prayer, even if it's silent prayer, it's something coming in that's expressed through the body. The language, the idea, in a sense, is kind of the subordinate factor. It
Mm.
is somehow the energy that sits behind whatever that is, which seems to occupy, and let's just call it the heavenly realm, in a space and time that's unlike the space and time that we experience, yet somehow when it's invoked, comes into our tent, our tabernacle, our temple, that somehow allows it to do something that it can't do in its own realm. Or
Right.
if it stays in its own realm, then ends up getting caught up with a whole bunch of other things. Kind of reminds me of the Nephilim and the
Yes.
charge that God gave the Hebrews to wipe them out, or at least kind of tried to, and then their spirits are just kind of wandering the earth because they can't really go anywhere and
Right.
they just kind of plague us. It's like, well, okay, where did that come from? It means that they're somehow, from a biblical worldview anyway, these demons, these unclean spirits are somehow still trapped in a space and time, not like ours, but still trapped there, like a current, like an energy, like a force. And maybe it needs kind of bodies, as Gurdjieff would say, we're an energy transformer.
Mm.
Maybe it requires something of us to help clean the unclean.
Mm. No, I think that's very well said, and it's very interesting to think about housing language, speaking language, health of the body. You mentioned a kind of emotional, spiritual immune system. There's a sense in which our ability to kind of house language, to kind of house the myth, to be inviting or to invite these things in is actually strongly tied to our spiritual immune system, right?
Yeah.
And I think there can be just kind of knee-jerk reaction to some of including Christians, not just non-Christians, but including Christians, and I think this book kind of points to it, is there can be a knee-jerk reaction against any talk about the unseen realm, right? It's okay to talk about God and monotheism, but once you start talking about sons of God and Elohim, I don't know, man. You need to get out. You need to go. There's a kind of there's a weakness of a spiritual immune system to not even be able to hear that. But you see, this is really problematic, because if hearing this actually increases the probability that you can articulate things that are real in your life that would then free you from them, your weak spiritual immune system is thus, in a sense, setting you up for slavery, or setting you up for being stuck in dynamics you can't get out of. So it's very, very consequential. And yeah, I guess I always think about too, like the role of story in a society, as like having this, like, these stories and narratives and structures are available to kind of meet the metaphoric and analogical needs of a community when they need them. And metaphor and analogy are not the same, but they're not exactly the same. But basically, to say a giant claim, all thinking is analogical. It's likeness. That's how thinking works. Hofstadter or other people talk about this, Aristotle. And so when you don't have these narratives, you're analogically impoverished. And that means you're going to be unable to think what's going on. And I think what we see, to go back to what you said at the beginning, that's hyper important. Everyone has this kind of sense that something's off. The problem is they can't articulate it because we live in an analogically impoverished society. We don't know our myths. We don't know our biblical texts. We don't know our books. We don't read literature. And when you have a society that doesn't read literature or do creative writings, they're not going to have analogical resources. So then all they have is this itch and this feeling. And here's the problem. The itch is a warning. It's like, hey, there's dynamics that are taking you somewhere you don't want to go. But all you can do is go, I feel it. And all it can do is get worse and worse and worse, which should be interpreted as evidence to go find the framework to articulate what that itch is getting at to free us from it. But we're not even thinking that. But we are analogically impoverished. And a function of these narratives in societies were to have analogical resources that were there for people when they needed them, and they didn't know when they would need them, so they just needed to be there all the time, and people needed to regularly attend to them to get them into their memory banks and societies, so that when the day occurred that you needed it, you knew where to go. Because if you don't know where to go when the day comes, then you can't be freed from the dynamic. And that's a part of what describes our world today, in my opinion. You have a bunch of people kind of going, something's off, but we don't have the religion or the cultural capital or whatever for people to know where to go to find the articulation that would free them from that itch and thus give them agency outside an SS, outside the dynamic. So all people can do is kind of go, something's not right. And all it can do is get worse and worse and worse because people don't know where to go. Where one could say a role of community and religion for all of society is to make sure there was a high chance that people would know where to go when they intuited something was off, to articulate it to themselves so that they were free, so they didn't blow up. So they knew what, because another way to put this, to use what you were pointing at, free, it's tied to knowing, if you don't know what to attend to, you can't have agency, right? So if I can't articulate, I don't know what to attend. Should I attend to that temple outside the body? Should I attend to myself? Should I attend to the inner? What should I attend to? If I don't have the right narratives or the right analogical resources at the time when I start to feel something, I'm not going to know what to attend. So I might just improve my Facebook profile or get a better job at the CEO because that might fix it. That might be what I need. You don't know. You don't know. And when you don't know, then the dynamics just pull you along some more because you can't tell the difference of what is contributing to the dynamics pulling you along and what would actually help you not be pulled along by the dynamics because you don't have the resources in your memory to pull from, to articulate it, to free you from that tension. Which again, I just note all of this is kind of hilarious. Like when you look at it from a big picture, it's kind of like funny, which means it's demonic because it's a tragicomedy, right? Like it's like, hey, so our life is like you're in trouble because of what you didn't know. And so you did the thing of which made it worse in order to be free from it. Yeah, that's the characteristics of the demonic. It's the other key characteristic is irony. That's why I'm obsessed with irony, which literature teaches. Irony does not mean this is an important topic, and I'm really enjoying it, Luke. So thank you for being here. So irony is not merely where something unfortunate occurs. That's what people, isn't it ironic? Irony has, in my opinion, a very specific, dare I say, ontological meaning, which I bring up every chance I get. And Harold Bloom talks about this. Irony is where X does Y for Z, and Y is precisely why X doesn't get Z. In fact, if X would have done anything but Y, it would have gotten Z. But it did Y, so it didn't get Z. So irony. Irony is like, an example from that song that everyone quotes is there's a wedding venue where the weather is always good, and that's the reason you go. And the one day it rains is the day you go, right? And actually at all the other wedding venues, there was no rain. Didn't rain at a single other wedding venue. There was just a little black cloud over that wedding venue. And the reason you picked that one is because it never rains. And that was the only one it rained at. That would be irony. Not merely that it rained at the wedding venue. That wouldn't be irony, but that it only rained at that wedding venue. And the reason you picked it is because it never rains. That's irony. So it's hilarious and sad. It's a tragicomedy. So irony is a key characteristic of the demonic and in dynamics that in spiritual warfare. Like it's always pulling you into the ironic. Now, someone may also, and I was going to say, someone may hear all of this and kind of say, no, demonic is like, oh, hold on. I thought demonic was inferno, torture, extreme violence, really terrible, right? Well, I would argue that to make a Christian claim, I would argue the demonic does not like being that way. Because it sees it, it's visible, and you're not going to be pulled along by that. You'll go, I don't like that, and you'll go the other way. So that's not the big problem, right? It is a problem if you're in it, but it's not the thing that's pulling you along in a Kafka story, right? And usually when the truly like horrific, which one could allude to what's going on in the world that starts with the E. That's kind of like where the dynamics end up, but then it's concealed, it's hidden, right? And what's wild about this moment is things coming out, right? But I would strongly argue the demonic should not be primarily thought about as Dante's Inferno. I think that's actually really messed us up. One could think of the judgment, I suppose, in those terms, maybe, but one even has to get into that. But we need to think about the demonic as more of these kind of ontological structures of irony, of the tragicomedy, of the Kafka novel, of this thing pulling you along where you don't want to go, of an enculturation that makes you ignorant, of true ignorance, which is when you're ignorant of your ignorance. Like these are the kind of weapons of spiritual warfare. And I think, and you would argue that, yeah, they lead to Dante's Inferno, sure, but if you're just looking out for Dante's Inferno, you're blind. You're not going to be attending to what you need to attend to, would be the point, right? You're going to end up, you're not going to be able to defend yourself from it. I guess I have a lot more notes, but the thing I was going to say is I'm also just thinking on what you were saying with relationship. Jordan Hall, who, we've spoken to, he has that, and I think this is true. He says the opposite of relation is ideology. Like the opposite of relationship is ideology, which is an interesting phrase. But if we think about it, I think there's truth to it, because for me, an ideology is an internally consistent system or map. It's the opposite of a Christian relationship is Christian ideology, for example, right? Because you filter the other through your understanding, right? You don't meet them, right? There's something where it's interesting that where there's a lack of relationship, dynamics are more powerful, because dynamics reflect ideology. So the opposite of dynamics is relationship, right? So relationship, and I think Christianity is all about that. Like relationships are the anchor that keep you from getting pulled along by game theory dynamics, getting you pulled along by a Kafka novel. And it's actually very interesting how many game theory problems you can overcome if people communicate, if they talk to one another, right? Like pick up the phone and say, hey, Gurdjieff, do you really want, is this cool? Is this cool? It's like, I thought it was cool with you. No, I don't want to end the world, actually. Maybe we should change that. He's like, okay. Like literally communication. And actually many of the worst situations geopolitically is when two countries refuse to talk to one another. Game theory would show that, right? But my point is that there's something about relationship that fights these dynamics that pull you along. And that's why a lot of spiritual warfare is to, pull you out of relationships, or to only understand your relationships through an ideological filter. And I guess the point, and then I'll throw it to you, the point I was going to make is we confuse relationship with proximity. I'm close to this person, I'm near them, therefore we have a relationship. No, you only have a relationship if you have shared attention, joint attention to one another, and the energy that affords. But since we think about relationship as mere proximity, then we think the two people controlled by their cell phones over dinner have a relationship, when really they're more so in proximity. But the inability to tell the difference between relationship and proximity then is also a demonic strategy in spiritual warfare to make us susceptible to dynamics. I'll pause. Anything at all you want to say?
There, just as you were talking, what had popped up to me about this nature of relationship, Christ's two great commands, which are intertwined, love God and love your neighbor as yourself, which is really tripartite. Yes. Because it's love God, love your neighbor as yourself, which also means you need to love yourself. And so there's this interesting relationship, which in a sense creates a container, if I can put it like that, whereby all those things are related: me, other, God. And somehow that is like a temple. It provides a protection, if you'd like, for all the other energies and forces which are trying to encroach upon that in some way, shape or form. And so that becomes interesting, that kind of, the centerpiece is based upon a contained relationship, which is weird, because as you were saying, it's really not in relation to space and time, but yet at the same time, it's where is my attention? So the faculty of attention, and Gurdjieff talks a great deal about this, is one of the only, well, I won't say one of the only, but it's one of the more obvious properties that we have that's able to transfer and also being able to communicate across realms. The body can't. The body's stuck in this one. And you need a body, but this faculty of attention and other things that might come off it you know, like kind of consciousness, all of those sorts of things. But there is something that this attention, this which literally means to collect one's energies, I keep my attention on those three things, and I need a lot of support in order to do that. Keeps me anchored or contained in a relationship that would otherwise be pulled apart because of the natural forces. And I'll say kind of natural because there's a whole range of what I would call just natural forces, like gravity and everything else. And then also there's these other kind of demonic forces which are clearly trying to interrupt that process, to try to cut you off. And if you're cut off from it, Gurdjieff has a classic word called the hasnamus. Hasnamus is someone either consciously or unconsciously who has cut themselves off from that relationship. They then become self-contained only within the body, and they become the devil's playground.
Right, right. I agree. And I think there is something here. The suggestion is our ability to master attention, I want to say, to train attention, seems to be precisely kind of the question of the ability to replace the sons of God, to rule over the fallen Elohim, that actually goes together. And if that's true, then the destruction of attention in our attentionalist economy, then very clearly has some sort of demonic function that is going on, right? And it does seem to be the case, even if one doesn't accept the spiritual warfare stuff, it does seem to be the case that the only way to fight dynamics is attention. Because, like, if you're not paying attention, you're at the party taking pictures of the party the entire time. If you're not
Yep.
paying attention, you just spent 3 hours scrolling on your phone. If you're not paying attention, then you're just listening to what the military generals are telling you, and you just started a war with Russia, and the Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't go well. Like, basically, Kennedy, hey, a great example. Kennedy, for some reason, just didn't listen to the military generals. What? Why? Why didn't he? He just ignored, he kind of ignored them. Well, it's actually a really fascinating story. He was going to go along with them, and then he had a happen encounter with an individual that made him rethink it. But there is something to be said with Kennedy that he kept, let me put it this way. He kept asking a certain question that no one else asked, that he attended to. He kept asking, why would Gurdjieff do this? Why would he do this? The military generals and everyone was like, he has done this, therefore we do X. Like, it just calls in effect. This occurred, therefore we need to do this. But Kennedy kept going, but why? Why did he do it? He knows this will cause the apocalypse. He knows it will. He was attending this felt sense that he knew this man because they had been secretly exchanging letters, and they'd actually talked about family. They had a kind of secret line of communication. So he had humanized Gurdjieff, right? He had a sense of who the man was. And because he did, and he attended, you could argue, to that knowledge, that personal knowledge, to that experience, he just couldn't let go of the question, why did he do this? Why did he do this? And so he was willing to entertain possibilities that everyone else wasn't willing to entertain. What exactly that was, it gets tied to actually a failure. A lot of them, there was an underestimation of how much the Soviet Union did not like the Juniper missiles in Turkey. Basically the government didn't even think about that. It didn't even occur to them that that was a problem. And it's so funny now because it's yeah, I guess they thought it was okay to put atomic bombs in Cuba, seeing as we did it in Turkey. For them, it was just equal, right? And actually Europe, it's really funny because Europe was looking over that and it's what's the big deal, America? What's the big deal? We have to live with these. There's nukes right over there. We have to live with it. Why can't you guys get over this crap? So it's actually hilarious when you look at the Cuban Missile, because we read that and we go, oh my gosh, I can't believe Russia would put those missiles. It's a horrible thing. They should have known. But yeah, Europe had nuclear missiles, atomic. I'm sorry, not nuclear, atomic. They were pointed all at it. And the Jupiter missiles were in Turkey. So in their mind, it was just equal to what everyone else was facing. And it was the only way to stop the CIA from doing another coup of Castro, right? But didn't even occur to the people that almost got us all killed. But because Kennedy kept attending that humanization, he was basically saying this: there must be a reason he's doing this that we don't see. That's what he was getting at. And he was right. It was the Juniper missiles. And no one was even thinking about that. Which is wild and kind of funny now because it's so obvious. But back then, but he was attending it, and he was willing to resist the pressures of everyone else. So he attended something inside, attentive felt sense. He attended it, resisted, and that saved us all. And then some luck, some incredible luck, and happening to run into the right person at the right time at the hotel. It's insane. So without attention, we can't fight dynamics. So attention really matters. So if we're losing attention, then dynamics win. That's why the war on attention is a massive spiritual war, because basically attention is what overcomes dynamics, because relationship overcomes dynamic, and you can't have relationship without attention. And I think learning to do that is tied to the divine rulership as well. That learning how to do that all goes together. I think also I love what you would. And then if you have any, it is already late. Dang it. We'll have to do this again. Any other thoughts? We certainly. I love also how you brought up the love your neighbor and love your God, which basically, if you can't love your neighbor, loving your neighbor is in fact requires the attention needed to resist dynamics. So if you don't love your neighbor, you can't love God, because you can't win the spiritual war, and you're going to serve dynamics. So there's something interesting where if you can't love your neighbor, that means you don't have attention, which means you can't find dynamics, which means you serve dynamics, not God. So the love your God and your love your neighbor go together in very profound ways. But I will give it to you for any thoughts. Please take your time. I don't mean, I don't know where the time went. This has been grand.
No. I could go down the rabbit hole on this for the next kind of couple of hours. But look, I won't. Maybe we can park it for another time. But it is. There's so much that comes up, and for me, naturally, it lifts me into a different space.
Right.
You know, it lifts me into a different quality of attention. And I'll hark back to Gurdjieff's quote of one needs all one's attention to study all one's attention. And so there's this whole world, this intermediary world, if you like, of what we call attention, that seems to cut across the seen and the unseen. And there's something in that which is quite a mystery for us, but one that we do need to grapple with. And it's interesting, like with the Cuban Missile Crisis, how much could have gone wrong. The probability of complete and utter annihilation must have been very high, but yet, through at least one man, something was working that turned it the other way. And there's, I would imagine, many other points in history where something has turned one way or the other. And it's normally by one person, one influence, or a small group of people. And you just go, the probability of that happening, considering the downward stream of what's normally history, which is essentially brutal and violence, and yet something is able to swim upstream, just tells me that it's something is operant there that is far more than just human.
Well, I'm glad you said that. And I've loved this. We'll do it again soon. This has been totally grand. There does seem to be, and there's this notion of providence in Christianity. When you look through, like, what are the chances? What are the chances? What are the chances? There does seem to be a certain sort of movement in the direction of the chance, right? That can be associated with providence. There is a question of if there's some sort of thing where providence is operation, but God's design is for where we can get to the place where we can rule without providence, because we've cultivated the intention to actually make things work without providence having that function, right? So there could, I think about that sometimes, that would have to be expanded on, but perhaps providence is like getting us to the place by realizing the stuff that like goes slightly wrong and everything doesn't go so well, to get us to the place where then actually we can rule. And there's a kind of handoff that's going on there. Can't prove that. I think about that. I think also there is a question of at the same time, is there something where there does come to be historical moments where Providence is like, well, now it's your turn, like you got to figure it out, and perhaps part of that feeling in the air is that kind of feeling, this feeling of we're now kind of entering the period where maybe Providence can't be relied on so much. Not because it can't do the work. It's like he constantly, he's constantly stressing, could God fix everything? Yeah, but that's not the original plan, right? Could he, there's eventually a sort of notion of divine rulership that human beings have, right? Perhaps part of the feeling in the air is tied to a sense that the role of providence is making more space for the rulership of human beings, that we really need like to just create fire under us to actually do the thing of cultivating attention in divine rulership, right? That there's a mechanism of a kind of, I don't want to say forcing function, but a kind of like, y'all really need to get a sense that you need to do this now. You need to actually get really good at the spiritual warfare thing. You really need to, there are real stakes. You need to get on it. And of course, that has to be expanded on. And I can't prove any of that. But there's something where it is interesting to me, at least that you kind of see in Christian churches that I listen to, or people, that there is this sense of we need to be thinking a more dynamic Christian life, not just salvation, and that's it. That there's real consequence if we don't. And it's interesting how people are intuiting that. And it feels, and one can kind of make sense of that growing intuition in light of the unseen realm and the need to replace the fallen Elohim and things like that. But I can't prove any of that, but it's something I wonder about. This has been fun.
No, I have I have the same thoughts. If he truly is our heavenly Father, then he's wanting his children to grow up, and sometimes a bit of tough love is needed.
Maybe that may be what's going on, because it is hard. It is very interesting, the point when you look at history and you like when you see the coincidences or the things, and of course this is vague and I'd have to justify it. It's crazy. Now, of course, you could argue, well, if they didn't turn out, we wouldn't be here, and so they had to turn out. And yeah, that gets into a big debate on, the fine tuning and different things. And even like Matt Segal talks about, lots of people are increasingly talking about how, well, this opens a can of worms, that cosmically there does seem to be a selection for the conditions of life. And that there seems to, like Levin and different people are talking about, like, there has to be a mechanism that increases the probability of that selection, right? Because the numbers are just too vast otherwise, right? Well, maybe that's just the providential version of, that's the cosmic version of providence that then moves into human and social life. And it kind of, there's been a selection through history. And maybe now, though, there seems to be a sense of the tough love is there, that there's a kind of, you need to move into this rulership, which, maybe that's when we'll find out what it means. Maybe, what is it? Carl Hayden Smith says we're yet to find out what it means to be human. We're yet to try. The human has been found too hard to try. Lungcar talks about that. Chesterton is like, it's not that Christianity was found lacking, it was found too hard, not tried. So it's not that the human was found lacking, was found too hard and not tried. And perhaps that's part of this moment. I think there's value to at least believe it is, and to try to rise to that occasion. But Luke, I've had a blast. Thank you. This has been too much fun. I've really enjoyed it, sir.
Thank you, sir. It's been great. Appreciate it.
I look forward to next time, sir. All the best to you, Luke. I appreciate it. You have a good one.